Textures and fluting, or more specifically, using fluting to create textures. Now I'm going to start the video with a bold statement. I truly believe fluting is one of the most creative toolpaths you have at your disposal within Carveco Maker. But sadly, I also believe it's one of the most underutilized toolpaths. So by the end of this video, I'm hopefully going to convince you to use it a lot more in your work, and hopefully you'll see the benefits. Let me know what you think at the end of the video in the comment section. Now before we dive into the on-screen tutorial, it's probably easier for me to explain some things about fluting right here and now. So when you are designing in Carveco Maker, normally we're looking down on our material from a bird's eye view, doing our shapes, our text and that type of thing to do our design. But when we are considering the fluting toolpath, we need to look at it from that angle, because essentially we are controlling the way the spindle is going to be going into the material, through it and back out, not just in a down, cut and back out, but there's a lot more creative options where we can control the curvature that it comes in, the curvature that it exits. We can make it zigzag through the material. There's a whole variety of options that we will get into during this tutorial. And I should probably also point out there is a lot of repetitive demonstration throughout the tutorial, because I'm basically showing you that changing little settings here and there will ultimately change the way the textures and things outcome at the end of it. So let's dive in and get stuck in with fluting. So as always, the first thing we will do is create a new model. Now for this demonstration, it doesn't matter what the size or the origin is, so I'm just going to leave everything as it is, but do make sure your resolution is turned up to full. We'll click OK and let that model generate. Now with this open, the first thing we are going to do is simply draw a polyline along the bottom of the model down here. So we'll come over to the polyline tool. I'm just going to come down to the bottom here, click and drag it along. As a quick tip, holding down Control will keep it in a horizontal or vertical position, basically allowing it to snap to certain angles. So we'll click over here and then just click Create to make that permanent. Now what we can see is we have this line right down here on the bottom of the screen. Now as I say, this has been deliberately drawn on the edge of the model, and you will see why shortly. Next we need to select the fluting tool. Now on the shortcut menu up here, it is the fifth one along, this brown coloured one. Also you can go to the toolpath menu and come down to the fluting toolpath here, which is the second one in on the 2D toolpaths. So with that selected, we can now start to work through the various options in the fluting toolpath menu. We're going to leave it on selected vectors. Now this option down here, reverse selected vectors. Now whenever you draw a vector, it has a start point, it has an end point, and it also has a direction. You may not realize it, but even a circle will have a direction, a start point and an end point. Now you may find it difficult to see down here on the screen, but we've got a green dot suggesting the start point, and you can also just see right in the middle this arrow pointing towards the right hand side. So we're going from left to right, and that is the direction of this vector that we are drawing. Now if we reverse this, it will basically flip it over. And as another quick tip, within Carveco you can just right click on your vectors and reverse the vector as well, but this will do it from the option of the toolpath rather than the vector. However, after all that explaining, I'm just going to leave it as it is because it is irrelevant for the demonstration I'm doing at the moment. Final pass thickness is also irrelevant at this moment. That just obviously controls the final pass that it takes off, how thick you want that to be. So you can do it basically as a really fine pass to guarantee you get a good finish. Let's come down to the cutting depth. Right, we're going to leave the start depth at 0, and we're going to make the finish depth at, I don't know, let's say make this 15 millimeters deep. Always leave the tolerance as the default value. Then we're going to come down to fluting tools. Now just to be clear, you can use any tool in your tool database to do a fluting cut. For ease today, I'm just going to select something fairly standard like an end mill. Let's just find a 1/4 inch end mill. We'll select that and bring it in. Now you can obviously go in and adjust the speeds and the feeds, but again for the purpose of this demonstration it's not relevant at the moment. I'm just showing you how the fluting toolpath actually works. Now this next option is where things start to get interesting, the flute profile. You can either tell Carveco a specific start and end profile as we can see here, or we can use a Z control vector. Now I'll come on to the Z control vector very shortly, and this is where we can really start to have some fun with the fluting toolpath. But for simplicity, I'm going to leave it on the first option for now. Then we will come down to the start flute and end flute. This is basically telling Carveco how we want it to control the way that it handles this line on a Z axis. And whilst it is fairly fairly self-explanatory. There are various options within here. You can have it as a straight line, a curved line, or a custom line. For now, we're just going to leave it on a straight line, and I'm actually going to make this 100% of the line length. Now for the end piece, I'm going to make this 0. Now what we're essentially telling it to do here on this start and the end point is come in an angled motion downwards to the depth that we set at 15 millimeters at 100% of the line length, and then go straight up basically to finish it. This will all become a little bit clearer when we generate the toolpath. Next, we're going to come down to the step down strategy. Now with the step down strategy, you have two options, scale or translate. This image at the side of it explains the difference between them. And ultimately, it is about the starting point for each pass being in the same position, but coming down bit by bit, or the start point moving offset for each bit of material that is taken out. Then we've got the extend above start. Now the easiest way I can explain this is imagine it like ramping the bit into the material. So it's basically saying how high do you want your bit to start above the material before it actually enters in. We'll leave that at 2 millimeters for the time being. The safe height is irrelevant at the moment, and we'll click to define the material, and we will make this 20 millimeters deep. And then let's give it a file name, Flute Test 1. Click calculate, and that will generate our toolpath. Now if I rotate this around, we can actually start to see what it has done. So if we just leave it there and zoom in a little bit, what we can see, it is generated that angle that I said right into the material with a sharp uprise at the end. So coming in at 100% to do the whole line with 0% for the finishing piece. I'm trying to get this a little bit straighter. It's always fiddly moving it around. But also because we're going relatively deep, it is having to do it in multiple passes. And this is the difference that I said between the scale and the translate. So if I select scale now and regenerate this toolpath, instead of 3 toolpaths starting at various points on the surface, they should all start from this left hand side over here. So if we click calculate now, and now we can see everything is coming in from that same point, but taking a shallow skim first, coming down a few more millimeters, and then finally the last one on the bottom. Now one of the reasons I did this on the end of the material is ultimately to show you the simulation. So there we can actually see what it is doing to the side of the material. It is coming down and putting that angle in. Now, this is where we can actually start to play about with the fluting tool and understand it a little bit more. Let's reset that simulation for ease. What we're going to do now is start to play about with some of these settings. So let's say we're going to make the entrance at 50% of the length, and we're going to make the exit at 50% of the length. What that should do is bring it down to a halfway point and raise it back up as it exits the material. So again, we'll leave this on scale actually, and just click calculate now to generate the new lines. And now you can see it is doing exactly what we just said. If we rerun that simulation, it is a point in the middle, so it comes down. I might change the color of this material because it's not really the clearest whilst we're doing this. There we are, that really helps. So what we can see now is it comes down to a center point and up to the end. And what you can also do is have a flat section in the middle. So for example, we could make the entrance of the fluting toolpath 25%, we can make the exit at 25%. So the first quarter it should come down, then it should go flat, and then the last quarter it should come back up again. So if we calculate that, and we can see already in the red lines exactly what it's doing. I will reset the simulation. You'll see me doing this a lot during this tutorial, just because it makes it very easy to understand what it's actually doing with a visual. So basically, between these options here, you can control the way that the bit is entering the material, passing through the middle of it, and then exiting it as well. Obviously, we're doing this very simple with just straight lines, but we can start to introduce curves. So what we're going to do now is come down to the curve option for the first one. I'm going to leave that at 25% again. And what this should do is make the entrance a bit more rounded, have a straight section, and then a straight exit up here. So click calculate, and again you can just see in the red lines there, but we'll re-simulate it again. And we've got a much softer entrance to a flat section, and then that angled diagonal bit coming out of the material. And again, we can do the same for the exit and make that a curve as well. Recalculate, and you can just see what it does. Ultimately, the more you keep experimenting, the more you will understand this tool. However, we can go one step further than these basic curves. We can actually start to create our own curve. Now, when you click into the custom curve menu, you'll see this little dialog box come up. You can move these blue points about with the mouse by dragging them in and out, and you will also see that the angle adjusts in the dialog boxes down here. So for example, we can make this like this, so it will make the entrance curve nice and soft, drop down pretty fast, and then go to the flat section. So if we click calculate that now, you can see that is represented in the toolpath. If I move this over, and we can just see how it affects it. Now perhaps we want to make this a fully rounded entrance into the material. We can pull this one right up here, and we can have it that way. So it will essentially follow the shape that we have in screen there down to the flat section. And if I calculate it, we can see how it's now modified that toolpath line. We'll reset the simulation for ease, and now you can see the difference in how that is treating that cut right there on the edge versus the way that it exits the material over here. But again, we can do exactly the same with the exit curve as well by playing about with that on the custom curve lines. Let's just move some of these points about a little bit and you'll start to understand how it works. Recalculate and resimulate. So that is a very basic introduction how you can use the fluting tool on its own, just using these settings that are available within Carveco. Now that's all good, but all you can really control is how it enters the material and how it exits the material. What you can do in between is pretty limited, and that's where this next option really starts to give us a lot of flexibility, the Z control vector. So I'm going to reset this model and we'll start again. So I've reset the screen. Now we still have our original vector down here on the bottom that we'll be experimenting with, but what I want to do now is draw a profile line that I would like the spindle to follow along that line. So again, we're going to come over to the polyline tool, and I'm just going to draw basically a very simple zigzag. Now the one thing I will point out is the start of these profile lines always have to be in a high position. So we're just going to come up here, simply click, come down, click, come up, and I'm just going to draw a random zigzag across here, and then we'll have it exit out here. Now come over, click create, just to make that a fixed line. And what we can do is kind of push this to one side just to keep it out of the way for now. The other bit of advice I would do is if you are creating profile lines like this, perhaps consider putting them on a separate layer just to keep your work area a bit cleaner. So with that there, what I'm going to do is come back to the fluting toolpath. I'm just going to extend this down a little bit. But instead of the specify start and end profiles, I'm going to use the Z control vector. Now when I've changed to that, you'll see a few options disappeared, but we now have a new option that has appeared where it says select the Z control vector. Now because I've already got that zigzag line selected, I'm going to click the select button in the toolpath menu, and we can now see what it's done is highlighted on that vector. It is the Z control with this little Z in the top left hand corner. Now what I'm going to do is come back to the original vector that we want to create the toolpath on down the bottom and select that. I'm going to leave all of the settings exactly the same for now. And what I'm simply going to do is generate this toolpath again. Click calculate, let it do the work, and then I'm going to come back over to the 3D view and actually rotate this around so you can see it again. So what it's done is created the cutting toolpath to the same profile as that zigzag path that we just did. And if I do the simulation for this, we can see it's putting it into the material as well. So this is what I'm saying about this is where it can really become useful and you can really start to have some fun with this, because essentially whatever you can draw, it will follow that profile. Now you may be thinking, okay, that's great, but that's just a simple line. Well, okay, let's come back over to the drawing board. We're going to delete that baseline at the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is come in and draw a circle in the center of the screen. I'm going to hit enter to make that permanent. And as we can see, as I highlighted earlier, we have arrows going around indicating the direction of travel for this. So I have that vector selected. We can still see that the vector over here is highlighted as the Z control. And we're going to regenerate a new toolpath now. Close this menu out the way, and again we will re-simulate this and we'll see what happens. Now from that angle, it doesn't look nothing. But if I start to rotate this around, what you can now see is that pattern is actually being cut into the circle of this. As I say, you can see the ups, the downs, and the various points that we had cut into it. So what you can actually do is not only control this on a straight line, but on a shape as well. And if you're wondering what the slight step is down here, this is where the toolpath effectively starts and finishes. Because they were at two different heights, that's how it's calculating. If I turn the toolpath lines on, you can actually see the difference there now when I start to rotate it round. But ultimately, all of those zigzags that we had are all in there with the toolpath, just cutting around in the circle. And it would be no different for any shape that we drew. So let's go back to the 2D view. Now what I'm going to do is delete this zigzag line over here, and I'm going to try and do a more curved line. So I'm going to select the polygon line tool. I'm going to come to draw smooth polylines over here, make sure that is ticked. I'm just going to try and draw some sort of zigzag, but with a more curved feel to it. So you can now see I've got a curved polyline, and one thing I'll point out at this stage is when it comes to the Z control vector, it doesn't matter the length that you draw it, it will adapt it to the shape that you are adhering it to. So for example, I've drawn this much bigger, but actually it will make this length of vector wrap around the whole length of the circle itself. So if you drew a very short line, it would effectively stretch it to fit whatever shape you are doing, and vice versa. If you drew a long line, it would shrink it down to fit the vector, obviously all in proportion to the height of the dips and movements within it. So I'm just going to push that over to the side slightly. I'm going to come back to the toolpath menu and can change this now to be the selected Z control vector. If I move that back to the side, you will just see the Z has appeared up there in the corner as we mentioned earlier. Now I'll come back and select the circle again. We'll generate a toolpath for it. And before I switch to the 3D view, obviously we've got some shallow dips going on here, and then we've got a very deep dip. Now obviously because we've set the finishing depth to 15 millimeters, all of this height range will be within the 15 millimeters that we have designated. So let's redo the simulation, and we can now see all of those curves in place. So we've got the shallow ones on this side. We rotate it round, we've then got that very deep one that we did over this side. So as I say, pretty much whatever shape you draw, it will follow it. Now I'll just do one more example. I'll come over to the 2D view, and I'm going to delete the original Z vector from earlier. And what I'm going to do is just bring it in a folder that I've got of pre-drawn lines. If I bring this on screen and shrink it down just a little bit. So you'll see in this folder that there's a range of vectors for us to use, and you can import SVG files or other vector formats for it to use as the profile line. Now I will highlight, I am selling this package on my website. There is over 50 different profiles for it to choose from in 3 different lengths. That's 150 separate files in total, all for $8. You'll find the link in the description area below the video. But what I'm going to do now is just randomly drag one in. Let's pick one to start with. I'll come down to this one here, and we're just going to drag it into the work area. So if I come back in here now, oh, that has imported it pretty large. So we'll shrink this down just to be a bit more reasonable on screen whilst we are working. So as I said earlier, it doesn't matter the size of your original vector, it will adjust it to fit the entire shape you're trying to make it work for. So I'm going to come back to the Z control vector and again select it just so we can identify that it is now changed to this vector over here. Come back to my circle, and then we're going to generate a new toolpath for this. And as I've already done multiple times, we will go back and now see this in the simulation so you can understand what's going on. So we'll move that around, and you can see all of the dips and the peaks that we had in the original control vector showing within this circle. Now the great thing about the fluting toolpath as well is different bits will give you different results. So for example, we were just using a normal end mill on this, a normal flat end mill. But let's change the bit over now to something like a big or a large radius bit. If I come all the way down, I've got some Cody's bits down here. So we're going to select is the 1/2 inch bowl cut Jenny right at the bottom. And this is a fairly large radius bit. If I click select, we're just going to generate the toolpath again. And I'll reset the simulation. And obviously look at the differences in the way that things displayed. Now we're changing the bit over. So instead of those sharp straight edges, we now have a much more rounded profile going on the inside of the cut. Now the reason this is important is when we move on shortly to doing things such as the textures, the different type of bit that you will play will generate you different textures, and you can really start to experiment and have some fun with them. Now I genuinely could go on for hours doing different shapes, different profiles, different types of bits in each one and show you the vast array of things you can do with the fluting toolpath. Even imagine something like a marble run where you need a gentle incline that winds down or something. Perfect opportunity for using the fluting toolpath. But the bottom line is it's all about understanding it, the way to control it, and what changes you need to make to achieve the outcome. Now we've understood that, we can move on to creating textures. So hopefully now you have a thorough understanding of how the fluting tool actually works, and we can now move on to the textures, because I say this really is the fun part that you can get some great results with. But you needed to understand how the fluting toolpath works in order to control the way these textures come out and the variations that you can achieve. So what I'm going to do now is come over to the polyline, and what I'm going to do is just simply draw one line up here in the top left hand corner, drag it across here, holding down the control key as say to keep it vertical, or horizontal I should say. Now I don't want this to be a polyline, so I'm just going to click create and make that a single line on its own. Now what I want to do is fill the space that we have with just repeating that line a few times. So I'm going to come to the block and rotate tool, and I'm just going to look at what settings we have. I'm going to leave all of these the same, except I want the direction to travel downwards when we are repeating this. And I only want, I don't know, let's say 30 copies of the line. We'll click apply. Now we have a series of lines there that are now generated. So I'll close that menu out the way. Now what I'm going to do is just open another folder, and we have again those similar vectors that I was showing you earlier, just in the medium format, and I'm going to drag one of these in. So we'll click number 3, bring that in, and again it's probably going to load in really large. So I'll just shrink this down quickly off screen. So we have the vector up here that we want to use the control vector. So again, we'll select that and make it the control vector. I'm still using the big bold cut at the moment, but we'll change that in a bit. But I'm going to select all of these vectors. But actually, I'm going to bring the finishing depth to something a bit shallower, let's say 5mm. Click calculate now. And then we're going to come over to the simulation and see how that looks. So there you can see we start to get these textures coming in. If I change this for a narrower bit, for example, let's just go back to something like a 1/4 inch end mill. Select that and regenerate the toolpaths again and resimulate again. You can see the different tools gives us different type of textures. This is then feeling more like, I suppose, almost like a wave pattern, but you've got these slightly sharper edges going on within them. But let's have some more fun. We're going to come back to the 2D view now. And what I'm going to do is select half of those lines, effectively every other line. I'll speed this up on screen. So with those lines selected, there are two things we're actually going to do. The first is reverse the direction of them. So we're going to right click on the vector, come down to reverse vectors, and we'll see those arrows in the middle of the screen change direction. So they are now going right to left, whereas the unselected ones are going left to right. The other thing we're going to do now is offset the lines a little bit just for some fun. So I'm going to take these lines to the right hand side by a click, and I'm going to highlight the other ones now and take them to the left. So let's drag across all of those. I'm going to take those left, one click. So now not only are the lines going in different directions, they are also slightly offset in their alignment. If we select all these again, the Z control is still active. So let's regenerate these toolpaths and resimulate. So just by changing the direction of the lines and offsetting them slightly, again we've got a completely different texture. Now what if I go back and make that something large, like the big bold bit we used earlier? Select the 1/2 inch Jenny bold bit, resimulate and reset. So there we have it. Now just by changing a few settings and offsetting things, we have created this amazing texture. Let's do one more just for fun. I'm going to come back over, we're going to delete the Control Z, and I'm going to bring another one in. So as we can see, the one that I've imported now is much more of a wavy line. So we're going to reselect that as the control vector, highlight all of the lines that we want to be implemented on, and regenerate the toolpath. And let's take a look at the simulation again. So again, a different profile. We've got a completely different texture going on there. We rotate it around. Let's try changing the finish on the simulation a little bit. See if that helps showing the different textures. Now obviously this is all looking pretty uniform at the moment because the offset of the lines are all very similar. But what we could do is just randomly move them about. Take every other line, shift that way, and we'll do the same with the other ones. And let's regenerate that again. We almost have like a bit of a honeycomb pattern going on there now. The different angles that it comes in at really does play with your eyes as you start to rotate this around. You're almost not sure if it's inset or as a relief within the material until you rotate it around. I'm just going to do one final test. I've never actually done this myself. I'm going to run this using a large V-bit. So I've just changed that over from a bold bit now to a V bit. I'm going to rerun this and let's resimulate again, see how this one comes out. Ooh, that is a bit of a weird one. But ultimately, what you start to see is obviously the more you change the vectors, the more options you're going to get. And it's really just about experimenting and seeing what options you like, what works for what you're trying to achieve. I mean, this pattern on screen may be perfect for what someone's trying to do. Probably not the texture that I would want, but ultimately it goes to show you what can be done by playing around. Let me just bring in this image and I'll show you just some of them that I've created previously in the software. So this is one, we've got a few different ones. I love the way this texture came out, and I'm actually going to carve this at some point. And again, this is probably kind of similar to the V carving that I just showed you, but obviously wider lines going on. But yeah, by far probably one of my favorites is just this one we've got here. If I show you, just a lovely uniform pattern, I say that would look great carved into a nice piece of wood. Now, if you have got to this point in the tutorial, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it when people watch the entire thing, not just the first few minutes. As an extra thank you to you, if you are considering downloading the Fluting Profiles package, use the code JamesDeanDesigns to get an extra 10% off. This will not be listed anywhere on the video. It is purely for you as a thank you for watching the entire tutorial. Now, that does wrap up everything, but obviously, as we have seen, the more creative you want to be with this toolpath, the greater the outcome you're going to get from it. So have a play, keep doing the simulations, keep doing the testing, and you really will see the thousands of variations that you can do using this toolpath. So I do hope you found the video useful. If you have done, please give it a thumbs up and make sure you've subscribed if not done so already. Final thanks as always goes to my patrons. I will see you all on the next episode.